What's happening, guys? We are back, and I really want to break down how I fish the spawn, so y'all come along.
Oh, there it was. Oh, guys, we got a good one. Oh my God.
What's happening, guys? I wanted to make a video real quick about the spawn, how I approach spawn, some of the baits I use for the spawn, and certain conditions while you're out there fishing the spawn. But a lot of the times when guys talk about the spawn, they talk about three parts of the spawn. There's a pre-spawn, the spawn, and then the post-spawn. But I'm talking strictly about the spawn. So what is the spawn? It's when the water starts to warm up, the bass start to move really shallow, and they start to reproduce. So what are some of the things to look for when the spawn is approaching? A lot of the times when you're catching fish in the wintertime into the spring transition, you can catch fish on certain locations every week, the same spots, and you can catch quality and quantity fish. When the spawn starts to come into play, those weeks of catching fish and using those baits somewhat seem to stop working. You can't catch them on them same points, you can't catch them on them same baits, and you just feel like those fish just kind of vanished out of that lake. Well, it's not that they're not there, it's just that they're not hungry, and a lot of the times they'll feed up prior to the spawn to where you can go ahead and catch those fish. Once it starts to die off, the only thing on their mind is the spawn, the reproduce, go up there, make beds, find their girlfriends, and have those babies. So some other things that I have a tendency to look for to help me know that it's the spawn is that a lot of the times in Alabama, toward the end of March, when that full moon approaches, when the water temperatures start to rise from the fall to spring, anywhere from about 60 degrees plus, those fish are going to start pushing up, and a lot of the times they'll push up in waves. They all won't go at the same time, so the spawn actually lasts a long time, all the way up until summertime. I've seen bass on bed actually in the beginning of the summertime when the temperatures are super hot. So you can still continue to fish these patterns and the baits that I'm going to show you in a second throughout the entire spawn leading up to the summertime. So like I said, I do have a little notebook here so I don't forget anything, because I typically do, and I probably still will, because the spawn covers so much stuff. Alright, so some of the things that I look for during the spawn and that transition time is or that I know that they're in the spawn, a lot of the time starts with the water temperature warming up, the full moon in March. Things start to turn green, you start to see that vegetation in the water. Another thing here in Alabama that I look for, especially in ponds, is that the geese start pairing up, and they actually start to reproduce too, and they'll have their little nest along the edges, and then you'll see some little geese running around too. So a lot of the time down here in Alabama, if you start to see geese pairing up, the bass are pairing up too. Now, I'm here in Alabama, and obviously if you live up north or in the east or in the west or whatever, and a little bit above Alabama, your times are probably going to vary, your water temperature is probably going to vary too, so it's kind of relevant. So when your water temperatures do hit these areas and you start noticing these certain things, that's probably when the spawn's going to approach for you. So there is actually a picture out there online. It's got like the United States, and it tells you exactly when the spawn's going to be in the south, the north, you know, whatever. Not the south, the north, but there's like a time frame of when the spawn should hit your location. So you might want to try to find that out. But all right, so we know what the spawn is and what it's all about. Now, where do these fish usually or typically spawn? A lot of the times I look for really shallow locations. It could be off the main lake. Also, if you have a deep lake and it starts to go up shallow, that shallow area is where they're going to go, because that water is going to warm up faster, especially when the sun's above. So they'll go to shallow locations. A lot of your little coved in areas, the backs of creeks, long shallow points, and there was something else that I said, was shallow flats, like I just mentioned, off the main lake. They will be your key locations. So once you do get to those locations, what should you be looking for next? So the next thing you should be looking for is any kind of cover in the water. Bass love to spawn or make their beds up against something that actually acts as a barrier, so they can better protect that bed or their fry. And the fry means that their baby or their babies. So some of the things I look for is some wood. It could be like a stump, it could be a tree laying down in the water, it could be a root. A lot of the times in river systems you'll have a lot of cut off cypress trees to where those roots are in the ground, and then they got those knuckles, and those bass love to be around those locations, especially during the spawn time. So if you're fishing rivers, you should look out for some of those cypress trees in the backs of those creeks or in some coves. Some laydowns, like I just said, you might see a brush pile up along the bank. That could act as a really good barrier, especially if it's in shallow water. Overhangs, a lot of the times fish like something hanging up over the water. It kind of makes them feel, even though it's not in the water, it makes them feel more secure. And it makes tall grass that's in the water or grass that's along the bank, they'll back up into that and use that as well. So look for taller grass or some sort of submerged vegetation that you can see in the water. They'll use that area as well. Any kind of rocks, a lot of rocks, they'll if it's shallow, they'll use a rock as well. So if your lake isn't known for having rocks and you see a rock, there may be fish in that location. So you want to pitch to it or flip to it or throw any kind of your springtime baits to it. All right, so we're talking about these locations and these certain things or structures in these water or objects in the water back in these locations where we felt like these fish are going to start spawning. There's going to be these things called high percentage areas, and these are going to be the areas that these fish are typically going to be spawning at or like to sit due to ambush points, shade, cover, or oxygen. So they'll sit in these key locations, and a lot of the times these bass will spawn along those locations as well. So some of those areas, if you're not really sure what a high percentage area is, you probably need to research it. What are bass fishing high percentage fishing areas? And let's just say, for example, you were going down a bank and it was just plain. There was nothing in the water, you didn't see anything, and you came up and there was a log. That log is going to be a high percentage area. You want to target that. Let's say you were going down a grass line. You were on the bank and you see all this grass, and the grass starts to come out just a little bit further than the rest of the grass that you were just fishing. That little point or that little piece that comes out is going to be a high percentage area. Let's take the vegetation again. You're going down, you see the vegetation, and then it cuts in just a little bit. It looks like somebody ran into it with their boat. That area right there is going to be a high percentage area. Let's say you were going down the bank and there was nothing, then you had like a little bush. That's a high percentage area. Now let's take it a little bit further. What if you had all this vegetation in the water and you saw like a little pocket, or you actually saw a little hole in the vegetation? It looked like somebody stuck a bucket in it and it came back out. That hole right there is a high percentage area. So these are some of the things that you can look for. High percentage areas are areas where you think are the most juiciest spots to throw your baits to hope that there's a really good fish there, especially during the spawn. So if you're not really familiar with high percentage areas and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, go ahead and look on Bass Resource or check out some videos on YouTube and research high percentage areas for bass fishing. All right, some key tips too to help you fish the spawn is to have some sort of polarized sunglasses. Polarized sunglasses will allow you to see through this water to actually see where these bass beds are and actually see some of the fish, to where you can go ahead and methodically try to catch these fish. Also with that, you want to make sure that you're wearing the appropriate colors for the condition. If it's an overcast day, it looks cloudy, it's gray or it's white sky because of the clouds, you probably want to wear a white or grayish color. That actually helps camouflage you a little bit better, especially if you get a little bit too close. If it's a bluebird sky, you probably want to wear blue. If you're a bank fisherman, you probably want to wear some sort of camouflage. You know, you don't want to wear anything kind of bright to where they can spook. Also, if you're a bank fisherman, you want to make sure that you're walking slow and they can feel that vibration. There's been plenty of times I started off on the bank, and I still bank fish to this day, to where if you're walking too hard, too loud, and you're moving around a lot, you'll spook the fish. The only benefit to that is that you just located that fish, and you can always come back to it and try to catch it later or the next day. So Also, a hat. A hat's really key too. A lot of the times, if you're just wearing your sunglasses and you know, the sun might penetrate down through the top of your glasses, or the back part of your glasses, or even the glare, and sometimes it will give you like a mirror image on the inside of your glasses, actually messing up your vision to actually see those fish or those beds. So make sure you're wearing a hat, make sure you're wearing sunglasses, and another key thing too that I always make sure that I have on is a hood. If you can have a hood or a hat big enough to where the sun is not coming down through your glasses, that will help you out tremendously. The small things, the small details will always add up toward the end and help you out. So they're just a couple tips. So let's talk about the conditions. I think of 4 conditions. My 4 conditions are overcast day, which is like a cloudy day with wind, an overcast day with no wind. And then you have bluebird skies with wind, bluebird skies without wind. And let's go ahead and go down the list and let's talk about how much easier it is to catch them compared to the condition that makes it a lot more difficult. So on my list right here, I said an overcast day with wind. The fish are probably going to be the most active. You could probably get away with your spinner baits and your chatter baits and baits that may cause a little bit bigger of a splash when you're casting to them. So they're going to be the most active times and the most active, the most active times to where you can go ahead and catch those fish. Now, when you have an overcast day and there's no wind, you probably want to be a little bit more subtle with your approach. Less splashing. You can still catch the fish. They're a little bit more active. A lot of the times, too, on an overcast day, those fish will give themselves up. Because they're so active, they'll be swirling around or splashing along the bank, either trying to get another female out of there, or a male chasing another male, or maybe even a little predator fish for their eggs. So they're always moving around and they'll give themselves away. So a lot of the times when they spawn, keep your head on a swivel, especially on an overcast day. Now let's go to bluebird skies with wind. They'll be slightly active, and what I mean by that is that they can see a lot better because of the sun penetration, to where a little bit of wind can disguise your presentation and your line just a little bit better than it would if there wasn't any wind, making it just a little bit easier to catch than if there was no wind. So let's go ahead and go to bluebird skies without wind. When you have a bluebird skies without wind, those fish are the least active and the most spooked. So you got to be very careful and way more subtle in your approach and how you get up there to them, how you cast, how you get the bait into the water. So you need to be very careful with those conditions. So real quick, here's just a real quick breakdown. In the morning time, even if it's bluebird skies or overcast, in the morning time those fish are going to be a little bit more active. In noon, those fish are going to start slowing down on the bite. If it's overcast, it may be steady. If it's bluebird skies or clear skies, you're probably going to have to adapt to something else. And then you have your afternoon bite. A lot of the times, if you're a tournament angler, the afternoon, you're already done around like 3 or 4 o'clock. And what I mean by afternoon is like after that time, because the sun's kind of going down and it kind of replicates the morning time to where that bite will still not be as good as the morning time, but it will be better than that noon time. So pay attention to the conditions, pay attention to the time of the day. And a lot of the times when tournament anglers are talking about tournaments, they talk about the guy that is going to win in any kind of tournament is a guy that is very good at adapting to the conditions and adapting to change. So I have 3 baits tied on. I have 3 baits right here right now. I have a Texas Rigg, small worm. I have a creature bait on a swivel head jig, and then I have a punching rig. So these 3 baits that I have right here are the only 3 baits that I need during the spawn to help me catch fish throughout the entire day. So a lot of the times in the morning time, regardless on the conditions, regardless if it's windy, if it's overcast or sunny, I'm going to start with this bait right here. This is a small 5-inch trick worm on a 2-watt worm hook with a 1/16 ounce weight. So this is a very light application. I usually throw it on 12-pound line, and I have very light tackle, or not tackle, but equipment with it. So I'll have a very light medium powered rod is about 7 foot, and then, like I said, 12-pound line. It doesn't matter what rod you use, it doesn't matter which reel you use, doesn't matter what line you use. I'm just telling you my setup. So a 7-foot medium powered rod, and I like medium because when I set the hook and the fish is huge and it's coming out, I want to be able to fight that fish and allow that rod to help me or assist me in catching that fish. I usually use 12-pound line because the lighter the line, the better you can throw those smaller applications. Alright, so now let's talk about the swivel head. The swivel head, alright, hold on, before we get to the swivel head. So I'll throw this along the vegetation line throughout the entire morning, and I'll throw them in high percentage areas. And if I'm not getting bit in these high percentage areas, or if I see those fish swirling around and splashing, I'll consistently throw to those locations more than once. A lot of the time, especially in some of the videos that I'm going to show you, I make multiple casts to these areas, and eventually something will go ahead and bite that and take it out into deep water, and you can go ahead and set that hook. So I will literally beat the bank around high percentage areas, especially the areas that I feel like the bass are going to be spawning with this small worm. Now throughout the day, if the conditions change, I gotta have to adapt to that, and I'm gonna have to change. And what I typically do is that if this doesn't work, if the little worm stops working after about an hour plus, regardless on the condition, I'm gonna switch it up. Now, if you have to switch it up, the conditions will determine what you're gonna switch up to, especially for me. If it is overcast, I'm going to switch to something that's a little bit faster, and I may pitch this fairly quick into some key locations. But if it's in a bluebird or clear sky condition, this thing right here is going to come into full effect. When you have bluebird skies, you have your polarized sunglasses on, and you skim the bank, you can literally see bass beds, and you can literally see the fish. So when you see that, anchor out and start pitching your bait into those key locations. Now my setup, I'll use this bait right here on 15-pound line on a heavy rod with a very fast reel. I use the Revo Rocket 10:0 gear ratio, and it comes back fast. The faster the reel, the faster you can get it back in there. A lot of the times those fish in that bed, if they're locked on, what they call locked on, if they're locked on, you can get those fish typically to bite quick. And if they don't see you, you can probably get them on the first or second cast. But if they don't, and they swim away and they come back, and they swim away and they come back, if you can't get them, you might want to go to another fish. But typically, if they leave and they come right back, you can kind of get those fish aggravated, and you can get them locked on to where you can go ahead and catch them. One tip: when I fish this and I'm throwing into beds, I always downsize my baits. I don't ever want anything too long. If you've ever bed fished, you felt that bite, you set the hook, and you come back and your pinchers are gone or your worm's cut in half. If that happens to you, you definitely need to downsize. So I always downsize. This is a very small little creature bait. This is probably a 3/0 hook. It's not too heavy, but the wire is heavy on this hook. So you want something a little bit heavier, especially during the spawn, because when you do hook into those fish, they're very, very aggressive, and they're mad, and they're going to fight like crazy. But one tip that I can leave you with is that if they're nipping at your bait, or they're taking your bait and you're setting the hook and it's breaking off, or your soft plastic's breaking off, one thing that I do, a lot of the times I will not T-expose this hook. What I mean by that, I will not put it back into the soft plastic to make it weedless. I actually leave it out just a little bit. Now if it keeps sliding down like this, I'll tack it just a tad bit, but just barely. A lot of the times when I leave it exposed just like that, a lot of the times I hook into those fish. So I will go around the banks. I will find these high percentage areas. Last week when I was fishing, I probably caught over 35 pounds on my top 5, catching huge fish just doing this right here. Flipping into beds, riding the bank, finding a location, seeing a fish, anchoring out, not getting too close, making long pitches to it, sometimes you can get super close to these fish, especially depending on how locked on they are. I'm talking about you can sometimes touch them with your rod. That's how close you can get to these fish, but I wouldn't recommend that. But I went around and I just rode the bank. As soon as I found them, boom, I mean anchored out and start pitching this bait right here. Now what happens if you can't catch them on this? They're not biting on that. You're seeing them, you're pitching in there, you can't get them, and you keep going around and you still can't get them. Well, some of the ponds and lakes that I fish will have vegetation in them, and I will pull out a punch rig. This punch rig right here, depending on how thick the vegetation is, will depend on how heavy the punch weight will be. I still stick to a creature bait, and yes, I do flip with a extra wide gap hook. I just have better confidence in it. I have caught them on a flipping hook, but I love this hook a lot better. I feel like if I set it to the side or I accidentally don't set it up, I still penetrate the side of their lid plate with this hook and barely ever lose these fish. I do make sure that I peg, and when I do fish or punch through vegetation, I always make sure that I make it weedless. I put that hook back into the soft plastic, and I always peg this the weight onto the line. So what I typically do is I'll run around, I'll see those fish, and I will try to get these fish here on bed. And from time to time when you're going around, you may see fish on bed, and then you'll start to see large clumps of vegetation. Now if the vegetation is super shallow, a lot of the times they won't be in that vegetation. The vegetation that I typically flip or pitch or punch, whatever you call that, I make sure that if the water is about 2.5 foot deep, I make sure that the vegetation isn't all the way up or all the way down. So what I mean by that is, like, I will punch through, and then I can feel the bait, the bait and the weight messing around in that vegetation, and then all of a sudden drop, and then I can pull up, pull down, pull up, pull down, to where I feel it hitting the bottom and then hitting the top of that vegetation. And I will work that location very methodically and very slow. So if the vegetation is about as big as this table here, I'll anchor out and I will work those locations. Now, back when I was talking about high percentage areas, in those big clumps of vegetation, look for little cuts, look for openings and little slits. You can go ahead and pitch. And sometimes with those openings, you can pitch the little swivel head. But if you're trying to get down through that vegetation, I highly recommend this right here. So you could punch all day if you wanted to during the spawn. If you don't have enough vegetation around your lake, you just target those little vegetation areas with this. And then I highly recommend you going around and pitching some sort of little creature bait, a jig, whatever you choose, into those beds. All right, before we go, I want to leave you with one tip. When I first started fishing and first started fishing the spawn, when I pulled up to a bed, I was sitting in deep water, casting shallow. I'd pitch in there, the fish would take the bait and literally go underneath the boat. So when you position yourself to catch these fish, I highly recommend not sitting right in front of their bed to where they would go underneath the boat. So if the bed's here and there's deep water out here, you might want to sit off on an angle, because when that fish starts swimming off to the side, you can sweep set the hook, or you can set it vertically. But that right there is a really good lesson learned, especially not in a good way, to where I can go ahead and share that information with you. So do not sit directly in front of that bed. A lot of the times when they take that bait off of that bed, they go straight out to deep water, which would be straight out to you. So don't do that. But guys, these are my rigs. Very small finesse worm, a swivel jig with a creature bait, and a punch rig. I can literally go around the lake and fish these conditions with these types of baits all day and catch them. And you need to make sure that you are adapting to the weather changes. If you don't adapt and you just keep on fishing the same way, the outcome is not going to be the same. So make sure that you guys adapt. I don't know if you guys seen these guys talk about adapting. but you need to learn to adapt to change, and you need to do it quick if you want to be successful. But guys, I really appreciate it. If you want to leave a comment or you have a question, please do so. You can also follow me on Bassin with Buddy and ask me some questions on there. But continue to follow Bassin with Buddy. I'll see you next time.